Chapter 1: Wilderness of Concrete and Steel. As a boy and a young man, I hadn't given much thought to my future. I suppose it had something to do with the everyday hustle and bustle it took to meet the demands of the times. There were moments, though, when it seemed as if I were moving in and around society in a drug stupor, doing shit that didn't justify the need. Consequently, the choices and decisions I was making eventually paved my path into a dark wilderness that would consume all of my wondrous years of discovery. Those precious years of youth squandered away behind prison walls. Regrets? Yes, of course. My biggest one is having trusted those who I mistakenly thought were my brothers in arms. Remorse? Absolutely, for having hurt those who were near and dear to my heart, and for those who inadvertently and by happenstance became victims of my crimes. For the longest time, I would become the cause of my repeated return to prison on plain old buzzard luck. Many years later, I came to learn bad luck had little to do with my recidivism. I, like many others, had become a product of a broken and corrupt criminal justice system. As a young man, I had been too naive to understand the rule of law did not apply equally to everyone, and I would be one of many who would be branded with the mark of Cain, targeted by law enforcement needing a resolution to an unsolved crime, a mark which would forever alter my life by identifying me as a bargaining chip for lawyers, prosecutors, and judges haggling over preferential cases. I, like countless others, would inevitably become a commodity of a broken system. I first began doing time when I was 16 and have thus far served 48 years of my life behind bars. I've done time in regular prison settings, in a foreign prison, and served an entire decade in Pelican Bay State Prison, one of the most depraved and oppressive segregated housing units in the country. A prison within a prison, from the mundane to the extreme. In retrospect, I believe 1989 was the beginning of a rude awakening for me. Having served time in countless institutions, you'd figure I would have gotten it by now. Obviously not. But karma was sure to come knocking on my door and turn my world upside down. And so it did. In 1989, I was charged with attempted first-degree burglary, a charge of which I was wrongly convicted. I'm sure there are those who will be quick to criticize and say, yeah, sure, that's what they all claim. And with good reason, I suppose, since most prisoners live in a state of denial. They'll swear on a stack of Bibles that they are innocent of the crime they have been convicted of, when in fact, they are as guilty as sin. However, and let me make it perfectly clear, in my particular case, the question of my actual innocence is not at issue here. I do not want anyone to misconstrue my writings as an attempt to lay claim to my innocence, nor to be used as an avenue to contest the legalities of my 1989 conviction. And least of all, do I seek retribution for the hard years I had suffered during the course of this particular incarceration? My sole purpose in bringing this conviction to light is to provide the reader with a better understanding how one becomes a product of the criminal justice system. In doing so, I hope to also provide the reader with a ringside view of the evilness that lurks in the heart of some of the men and women entrusted with the power of life and death over a fellow human being. In any event, as mentioned above, I was arrested in the early part of 1989 on a charge of attempted burglary. In the state of California, the charge of first-degree attempted burglary carries with it a sentence anywhere from 6 months in the county jail to 2 years in prison if convicted. During the course of my litigation, I chose, under the direction of counsel, to be tried by a judge rather than by a panel of 12 jurors. I was foolishly led to believe that, because the charge against me was a simple case of mistaken identity, the presiding judge would surely rule in my favor and dispose of the matter. After all, I was not arrested at the location where the attempted burglary had allegedly taken place. The suspect the police had been looking for was described as a young man wearing a plaid shirt over a pair of blue jeans. I was arrested near my place of residence moment after the 911 call had been placed. Only unlike the culprit the police were looking for, I was a 45-year-old man at that time wearing a black Nike sweatsuit. In the past, I had always been one to take responsibility for whatever illegal activity I had been caught at. Always paid my dues where my dues were due, so to speak. But this time was different. I was actually innocent and foolishly believed justice would prevail. The judge found me guilty as charged. Now get this, the judge went on to sentence me with 2 years for an attempted burglary, 2 additional years for having served 2 prior prison terms, and an extra 10 years for having 2 prior prison felony convictions, which I had already served time on. A total of 14 years. Had there been a bigger hair up the judge's butt, he would have attached another 10 years. Lady Justice isn't blind at all. She tends to peek out from beneath her blindfold to see who stands before her, administers justice to those who can afford it. Sometime after the judge had pronounced the sentence, I received a letter from a young man who had been arrested on a misdemeanor charge. A letter that to this day burns freshly in my mind. In this letter, Anthony Gouveia confesses to having committed the crime which I had been wrongly convicted of. He goes on by apologizing for not having come forward sooner with this information and for having placed me and my family through this painful ordeal. He had mistakenly believed that I would get time served, or at worst, end up with a little jail time. But after having learned of the sentence the judge had imposed, Anthony Gouveia found the need to write the letter with the hope of making things right. So many thoughts ran through my mind after reading his letter over and over. So many mixed emotions. At one point, I was thrilled with the prospect of being exonerated. On the other hand, I believe if Anthony Gouveia had walked through the jail gate and told me what he had expressed in his letter, I would have lashed out violently, thus adding many more years to the 14 I had already been handed down. So in this regard, I suppose the letter came as a blessing. It provided me with the time by which to sort things out in my head, to chill out and ponder what was now occurring. I thought to myself, what would I have done had I been in Anthony's shoes? Would I have done the noble thing or simply shrug it off with the simple-minded view of, oh well, that's the way the cookie crumbles? Like so many often do, Anthony Gouveia and I did not know one another personally. He nonetheless knew who I was by way of reputation. Thugs, who are strangers to one another and living in the same hood or city, seem to know one another by and through reputation that precedes them. In the thuggery world of the miscreant, there are times when one will be falsely arrested, tried and convicted for a crime committed by someone else. It goes with the turf. The actual perpetrator is under no obligation to surrender himself to prevent a miscarriage of justice. The matter is usually dealt with outside of the court arena. It's one of the occupational hazards thugs risk when in the mix of the game. Ironically, the thug who falls victim to a crime he or she had not committed will eventually come to know who the actual perpetrator had been. Yet the accused is bound by a code of silence not to involve the authorities. The innocent party is caught in a catch-22 situation. The most one can hope for is for the guilty party to come forth on their own, but that's not usually the case. I have known several convicts who have taken the fall for a crime they had not committed. What's more disturbing is that the authorities would oftentimes know who the actual guilty party is, but are either too lazy to prevent a miscarriage of justice, or they simply don't give a damn who takes the fall. One catch is as good as the next, guilty or not. With Anthony Gouveia's letter now in my possession, I now had freedom in the palm of my hand. The thought of being back home with my loved ones was encouraging, but the moment quickly passed, overshadowed with the possibility of, what if what I held in my hands was no more than a cruel and devious prank by a hater? One cannot lose sight of the fact that thugs live in a predatory, unscrupulous world, where honor and the noble are few and far between. To further dampen my hope, I had been around the criminal justice system long enough to know, even if the letter were authentic, on its face, it didn't prove a damn thing. At this point, the letter amounted to no more than a note, inadmissible in a court of law. I had been around the judicial system enough times to know I could not pursue the legalities in court. I had been around the judicial system enough times to know I could not pursue the legalities in court. Not without first knowing if Anthony Gouveia would be willing to testify to the letter's authenticity. As mentioned earlier, I did not know Anthony Gouveia on a personal level. I would later learn he was a stand-up guy who respected the moral principles of a convict. Many of us may be judged by society's standards based on the notion that we are nothing more than thugs and lawbreakers. But that particular notion is way off base. In support of his letter, Anthony Gouveia would later come forward with a declaration detailing how he had committed the attempted burglary. I suspect the authorities must have gotten wind of Anthony's confession, because soon after I was quickly transferred out of the county jail and handed over to the California Department of Corrections, where I would be processed into the prison system. Dual Vocational Institution, DVI, at one time was considered the only prison vocational center in the state of California. That was long before it was converted into a reception center from where newly committed prisoners are processed into the prison system. The processing procedure normally takes 30 to 90 days, during which time the prisoner is screened and classified before being sent off to one of the many prisons scattered throughout the state. Human trafficking at its finest. I cannot remember the exact date when I arrived at DVI. At this point in time, the days and months no longer mattered. I had too many years to deal with to be thinking of the days and months in between. I can only recall it being midsummer of 1989. Temperatures in this area get into the 3-digit numbers during this time of year. I didn't know it then, but it would be the last summer I would see the outdoors. DVI is located some 10 miles east of Stockton, California. I arrived from the Monterey County Jail along with 4 other prisoners, one who happened to be a close friend by the name of Andres Romero. Andres, who was being sent back to prison to serve a 90-day stretch for having violated one of the conditions of his parole, and of course, I was on my way to begin a 14-year sentence. Andres and I were from the same hood. Though much younger than I, he was mature well beyond his years. Children from poverty-stricken neighborhoods tend to be that way. Their environment forces them to mature more quickly than children from middle, high-class neighborhoods. Their likelihood of survival depends on it. I was more of a big brother to Andres rather than just a homeboy. We had become close. So when he first learned of my arrest and conviction, he became extremely agitated. At times, he seemed more troubled than I. One day, while Andres and I were strolling in the yard, I happened to notice him behaving a bit strange. He normally possessed a happy-go-lucky personality, always quick with a joke, generous and giving of himself. But on this particular day, he seemed distant and disturbed about something. Normally a talkative individual, on this day he was withdrawn. Something was definitely weighing him down. I've known him long enough to know when something was bothering him. We had been down this road plenty of times, so I asked, "What's on your mind, homie?" "Nothing, why?" It was common for him to answer a question with a question, and I usually had to prod further. I expected an explanation. Sometimes I wondered if he deliberately engaged me into these tug-of-war, question versus question bouts to psychologically prime me into what he needed to get off his chest. Or maybe he was just warming me up to the subject. "What do you mean nothing?" I prodded on. "You get a Dear John letter from your flame or what?" I knew that wasn't the case. A Dear John letter from his girl wouldn't have bothered him in the least, especially when he was only doing a short bid. And besides, the girl he was currently with was as carefree as he. If he were out there on the streets, she'd be right at his side. But whenever they were apart, she'd find comfort in the arms of another man. It was one of the consequences that comes with doing time. Andres had come to terms with this long ago. So what I had thrown at him about his girl had merely been a ploy to ease the tension on whatever was really weighing him down. "Nah, you know it ain't nothing like that," he replied solemnly. "It's just that I've been thinking." He had a habit of saying those exact words each time he wanted to have a serious talk. We found a spot towards the west end of the yard for a piece of privacy, and it was there where friendship showed its true colors. To paraphrase what he had expressed, he said he was feeling fucked up, that he was back in a prison over a chicken shit parole violation while I was on my way to do a long stretch for something I hadn't done. "It ain't fair, homie," he said. "You ain't walking around with your head hung down, but I know it's gotta be bothering you, cause it sure in the fuck is bothering me." It wasn't his way of talking, blunt and to the point. I admitted to him that yes, it bothered the hell out of me, but walking around with a chip on my shoulder wasn't going to change a damn thing. It would only aggravate and compound my situation. But in all truth, I felt this way only because I still held on to the hope that justice would prevail and the judicial system would surely correct a grave miscarriage of justice. "Listen," he said, "I'll be out in a couple of months, and I can get at Tony, Anthony Gavea. Make him get right." Andres and Anthony Gavea were in the same age bracket and had attended the same school at one time. Andres also mentioned he had gotten wind of a letter Anthony had written me, but wasn't clear as to its content until now. Andres was offering to have a talk with Anthony, persuade him into coming forth with the truth. But I wouldn't ask that of Andres for the obvious reasons. First of all, knowing Andres, His method of persuasion could at times be, well, somewhat unorthodox. If he were to do something drastic, it would be a matter of time before the authorities got wind of it, and he'd be back in prison on a charge of conspiracy or worse. Secondly, Anthony Gouveia had already shown a good faith effort of making things right. However, if push ever came to shove, we would always resort back to Andres' unorthodox method, always known as street justice. You can't do that, I told him, and explained to him why. What Andres did not know at the moment was about Anthony's declaration. Actually, I had not shared that information with anyone. It's not something you want to do in a jailhouse setting. Sharing information with the wrong prisoner may later prove detrimental. There are those who will say and do most anything to get out from underneath their own predicament of incarceration. There are prisoners who will befriend you simply to gather information they can manipulate and use as a bargaining chip. It stands to reason. Every prisoner has his own share of legal problems to contend with. So why would they be so overly concerned about your own? But in Andres' case, it was different. He was like family. I had no problem sharing with him what I would be reluctant to share with anyone else. After I had finished telling him about Anthony's declaration and of his willingness to do all he could to get me back in front of a judge, Andres' anxiety subsided. He was once again the happy-go-lucky kid I knew. Hell, well, you didn't tell me this shit before, he said with a broad smile. Because I was still sorting all this shit out in my head, I replied with false sarcasm. I went on to tell him that the best thing he could do for me was to give Anthony a helping hand in finding a lawyer willing to pursue the case. It's all I could have asked of him. And with that, we continued our stroll around the prison yard. By this time, Andres had retrieved his haughty stride, shoulders back, head held. A couple of weeks later, Andres and I were both screened by the classification committee who validated our status as gang members, and as a consequence, we were both given an indeterminate shoe to be served out in one of the security housing units, SHU, situated throughout the penal system. Because Andres was only doing a brief parole violation, he was being sent to the Corcoran SHU, located near Fresno, California, to finish out his 90 days. As for me, I was being sent to one of the security housing units in Pelican Bay State Prison, some 10 miles from the Oregon border, where I would spend the next 10 years. The following day, we went our separate way. I can still remember Andres saying, "Don't trip, homie. I'm gonna look out for Tony. We'll find you a good lawyer as soon as I raise on up out of here." Unbeknown to me at the time, it would be the last time Andres and I would see one another. Pelican Bay State Prison first opened its massive bunker like security housing units, SHU, in 1989. I would be in one of the many buses headed there. The California Department of Corrections, CDC, constructed Pelican Bay State Prison with the idea of sifting out the worst of the worst inmates throughout the entire California prison system. Prisoners who were considered to be disruptive to the orderly running of an institution. They began by rounding up gang members and suspected associates. They went after jailhouse lawyers, radicals, and for good measure, the mentally impaired. What awaits prisoners in Pelican Bay security housing units with its eerily silent doors is a purgatory of sorts. A vacuum of uncertainty, sealed off from everything and everyone. A place where one is virtually entombed inside a concrete vault, whose scarred and pitted walls depict the idleness, boredom of madness of previous occupants. Pelican Bay is a world of its own, where refuge can only be found in a dreamless state of sleep, or in flights of fancy, or through death itself. There is a look in the SHU prisoner's eyes that is haunting, a foreboding look from eyes that have stared far into the abyss. I can't recall with any certainty the exact day my journey into the netherworld began. All I remember is it had to be in the wee hours of a foggy September morning in 1989. One by one, waist-chained, handcuffed, and shackled, we were herded into the belly of the Grey Goose, as these prison transportation buses are commonly referred to throughout the California prison system. A dreadful silence hung in the air like a dark, heavy cloud. It seemed to forecast the psychological, emotional storm we would all come to know in the life-negating emptiness. A dreadful silence hung in the air like a dark, heavy cloud. It seemed to forecast the psychological, emotional storm we would all come to know in the life-negating emptiness that awaited our arrival in the security housing units. The bus engine hummed with a seemingly morbid readiness to transport our bodies to that temple of doom. The look on the faces of the armed guards threatened bodily harm to anyone who dared open their mouths in protest. Each time one of them would bark out a directive, he'd slap his baton against leather gloves to emphasize the inevitability of our plight. Intimidation of physical harm is a practice widely used by prison guards to wear a man's spirit down. Beat the prisoner down into submission, just like they were doing in this instance, placing us on that bus crammed together like cattle in a boxcar. We sat shoulder to shoulder in the hot, suffocating section of the bus. The stench of body odor permeated the air with hatred. While the guards sat smirking behind a plexiglass partition in the air-conditioned section of the bus, we had plenty of reasons to be angry. As I sat there, I was momentarily gripped by a haunting reality, that it were fist-in-your-face moments such as these that served as a reminder of the cynical path fate had paved before me. How many times have I traveled similar roads, I thought, and how much more would I be able to withstand before time, as with everything else, will eventually take its toll. I had taken my place in that bus not for failing to abide by the system's set rules and regulations, but for choosing to challenge prison officials who deliberately and with malice intent manipulate those same rules and regulations to suit a personal agenda. As the bus roared angrily down Highway 101, the trance-inducing drone of the bus engine lulled me into the reflections of my life. Memories soared past me like the scenery flying by outside the bar-tinted windows, and as swiftly as the life I had led thus far. My father served under General MacArthur during the Korean War, where he was killed in action in 1952. To compensate for his death, the U.S. government began to send my mother a check of $100 each month, hardly enough to sustain her and her 8 children. My mother had no alternative but to take on a minimum wage job as a cook. As I grew into my teenage years, I began to resent the U.S. government because of what my mother was forced to endure after my father's death. I was of the belief that when soldiers lay down their lives for this country, the U.S. government has an obligation to see to it that a fallen soldier's wife and children will be treated with dignity and with common decency. Laying down your life for your country is more than just a patriotic chore. It's a sacred, supreme sacrifice. No one should be treated as an expendable commodity. Had they had a Tunnel 2 Towers Foundation back in those days, things might have been different for my entire family. But then again, if fishes were wishes, we'd all cast nets. Driven into poverty, our family was forced to move into a labor camp, a camp formerly used by the U.S. government as one of the inland concentration camps for the internment of Japanese Americans. I can still remember stories my mother used to tell me of what the Japanese Americans had been forced to endure after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. My mother would metaphorically use the internment of Japanese Americans to illustrate what we as minorities were also up against. But as a child, back in those days, living in that labor camp was more of an adventure than a condition of oppression. I was much too young to understand the seriousness of it all. On the other hand, I can only imagine what a terribly, terribly difficult time it must have been for my mother, trying to raise 8 children on her own. As I look back now, I am able to clearly remember the outhouses, an outdoor concrete shower room, crawling with frogs and earthworms. The squalor conditions we lived in, along with all its strict rules and regulations, are so much a depiction of the current cycles of my imprisonment.